I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, breaking down Canada's ecological footprint and its plan to protect land and water for future generations.
Protecting the ecological foundations of our country and our economy is a great responsibility that we owe ourselves, each other, and future generations. And Indigenous leadership is central to that effort. We know that nature is our greatest resource, and by investing in it, we're investing in ourselves.
That was Julie de Bruzen, Canada's Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Nature. She was speaking in an announcement on the federal government's measures to protect nature back in March. That day, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled Canada's $3.8 billion strategy that, in his words, will protect and restore critical habitat, ensure industrial strategies complement our conservation efforts, and mobilize new capital for nature. Meanwhile, new data from York University's Ecological Footprint Initiative paints a troubling picture of Canada and the world's ecological footprint. The initiative found that human civilization is using the planet's resources at a rate equivalent to 1.7 Earths per year. It also found that in 2025, each Canadian used an average of 6.6 global hectares, which is roughly 4 times what's sustainable for the planet. Researcher Eric Miller has directed the initiative since 2018, and he says that, quote, "For the world to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, humanity must reduce its total ecological footprint by at least 59% over the next 25 years, unquote. So with that, what are the solutions? Miller joins me now from Toronto with more on that. Eric Miller, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So you stated that, quote, Canada's ecological footprint is limiting opportunities for people elsewhere on this planet to live a good life. Can you talk a bit about what you meant by that?
Yes, we have one planet. This one planet is an amazing planet. It provides a lot for us as humans, obviously, but it is limited in its ability to provide for us, to regenerate flows of materials that we use to either to consume as food, materials that we use to build structures out of, like forest products, for example, and also, very importantly, the planet's capacity to soak up the carbon dioxide emissions generated from us as humans burning fossil fuels. And so when we put that all together, as we do in our research initiative, we find that our demands as humans on the planet are in excess of what can be sustained over time. And of course, there's a tremendous variability in the capacity of lands and waters to sustain us, whether we're looking at lands and waters in Canada or other countries of the world. And there's a tremendous amount of difference in our demands as humans across countries and even within countries too. And when we put it all together, we see that there's immense pressure on this planet. And we can also look at how that compares to the outcomes that we get. After all, we all want the good life, and there's various ways to achieve the good life. Some are more, let's say, metabolic with regards to using the planet's resources than others. And so one of the messages that we find from our research is the message that you just mentioned before, that Canada's ecological footprint is very large. And when we add it together in a planetary context, it is limiting opportunities for people elsewhere on the planet to live a good life. Elsewhere on the planet, people are even more impacted than some of us in Canada are of resource scarcity and the consequences of climate change.
You're the director of the York University Ecological Footprint Initiative. Can you talk a bit more about what it is and how it got started?
The Ecological Footprint Initiative is a research exercise at York University. Since 2019, we have been training students in what we call sustainability informatics, and we have been leading research and the production of what we call national ecological footprint and biocapacity accounts. And so what these accounts are is they measure humanity's use of the surface of the planet with regards to what the planet provides us in terms of food, in terms of building materials that can be regenerated over time, also how much area we occupy through our buildings and infrastructure, and also quantifying how much of the planet's surface area is needed to soak up our greenhouse gas emissions. We generate what we call the accounts every year, and we just launched our latest edition of the accounts on April 22nd, which is Earth Day. And that data has statistics from 1961 to 2025, covering all countries on the planet over that time period, and also summing that up for the world as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And so the report talks a lot about Canada's biocapacity. Can you talk a bit more about what that is?
Yes, biocapacity is a measure of the potential of any area of land or water to support a human ecological footprint. And so what we do is we have statistics about the area of Canada and how that is detailed in terms of terrestrial areas, aquatic areas, and whether the terrestrial areas are occupied by buildings and infrastructure or whether they're covered by forests, whether they are covered by grasslands or agricultural land, and so on. And we quantify the capacity of those lands and waters to support an ecological footprint in a unit that we call a global hectare. And a global hectare is a national hectare that's adjusted to what it is in a global context by either adding to or subtracting from that hectare based on, let's say, the amount of forest growth in Canada as compared to the world average. And so that unit of a global hectare allows us to make comparisons between the capacity of lands and waters in Canada to support an ecological footprint, and also the capacity of lands and waters anywhere else on this planet. We all know Canada is a very large country. There are a lot of hectares in Canada. There's also a lot of global hectares of biocapacity in Canada. Canada has a very sizable amount of the world's biocapacity within the boundaries of Canada. About 4% of the world's biocapacity exists within the boundaries of Canada. And that's quite significant because only about 0.5% of the world's population lives in Canada. So Canada has this great amount of biocapacity, and it's important that we recognize that. It's important that we understand it, that we cherish it, that we conserve it, and that we also understand the importance not only to us as Canadians, but also the importance from a global perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Back in March, Canada announced a $3.8 billion strategy to protect lands and waters. What do you make of the federal government's approach to, in their words, protect nature?
Yes, I read that announcement with interest, but I guess I'm a bit guarded or a bit cautious as to what the objectives are about that and how it's going to be measured. With that strategy they announced, there were several components to it. One of the components spoke about valuing Canada's natural assets. To that, I would ask a few questions. What's the unit or units that are being used to evaluate the importance of nature? Not much there, except there was a reference to sort of a monetary equivalent value of Canada's natural assets. But to that, I question whether that value only relates to the economic significance of forests when they're harvested versus, for example, forests when they're not harvested. There was talk about increasing the amount of protected areas in Canada. I would ask the question, though, are these protected areas identified after determining the areas meant for transformation, consumption, mining, etc.? In other words, are these protected areas sort of the leftovers after prioritizing the focus on resource extraction and so on? Anyways, I have a lot of questions about that. And so I think all of us should pay a lot of attention to the details that we'll see, I guess, over the coming years.
I'm glad you brought up protected areas because we're actually going to hear from Stephanie Thorassie, who leads the River Watershed Alliance. What do you think is the role of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in this conversation around ecological footprints?
It's very important. Indigenous protected and conserved areas are to be cherished, are to be understood, are to be rewarded, are to be valued. And I think there's several aspects of how the research that we do can tie in to that. So the research that we do helps to quantify one dimension, I guess, as to the importance and significance of lands. And when I say lands, I mean areas of the planet, whether that's aquatic or terrestrial. And even though the work that we do is focused on measuring the capacity of lands and waters to support our ecological footprint, the obvious question relating to that is about the governance of lands and waters that provide so much for us, and the governance of all of us and our consumption and so on as that draws on lands and waters. And so there's a number of ways that our research can be used. It can be used to add additional measures of significance to all sorts of questions around the sort of potential and of Indigenous protected and conserved lands across Canada and across the world as well. The statistics that we generate also quantify the capacity of lands and waters to support trade flows. And that's really important because the lands and waters in Canada relate not only to what goes on in Canada from a consumption or a production perspective, but also in relation to the rest of the world and vice versa. And so Indigenous, conserved and protected areas, not only in Canada, but around the world are very important. This can help us to understand those relationships through trade flows. Because often that's not apparent to a lot of people as to, let's say, how much area of land and water is embodied within, let's say, I don't know, a kilogram of corn or let's say from a kilogram of emissions emitted in this part of the world or somewhere else, et cetera. So I think that can be really, really important.
And relatedly, the federal government has been increasingly funding Indigenous land guardianship programs. And I'm wondering, what role do you think that plays in reducing ecological footprints?
There's a good potential to have that reduce ecological footprint if and when we engage Canadians and people across this planet in understanding what their ecological footprint is and ways of economizing on it. And that's where data that we generate on a national basis is useful, but it's also very useful to take this national data and then also relate it to more sort of smaller areas of geography and even relate it to things, to groups of people, whether they're quantified in terms of cities, in terms of neighborhoods, even down to the level of households and even individuals as well. And so our research supports other derived research, such as understanding ecological footprint at an individual or household level with the use of ecological footprint calculators to sort of estimate how much an individual person or an individual household's activities, consumption patterns, constraints and opportunities relate to their ecological footprint. And that can be really useful because we find that about a third of, at least in this part of the world, about a third of our ecological footprint relates to things that we have some degree of control over at the level of an individual. About a third relates to those things at a household level. In other words, with other people that we live with in common. Things like the temperature that we set as a target for heating or cooling, a lot of the shared, let's say, equipment or appliances and that kind of stuff. And then the remaining third, or it's actually slightly higher than a third, about 40% of ecological footprint relates to broad decisions that we make at the level of society as a whole. Decisions around how we generate electricity, decisions around public infrastructure, decisions about how settlements are planned, etc. And so that's where this research, when we sort of take it down to both the micro level and also we also keep our focus at the macro level as well, this can be very useful. But of course, all of that on the ecological footprint side needs to be understood in relation, of course, to biocapacity and all those involved in providing and protecting and managing the lands and waters that we depend on.
And has the initiative made any policy recommendations to the federal government or provincial governments? And I'm wondering, if so, what are they?
We have not made official policy recommendations in our work, but others who have used our research have made recommendations, suggested, and have also used our research to comment on things. I'll give you a few examples. At a provincial scale in Ontario, Ontario has a biodiversity strategy, and the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy uses our calculations of ecological footprint and biocapacity at the Ontario level as a way to assess human pressures on biodiversity in this part of the world and on a planetary basis. And the 2025 State of Ontario Biodiversity's report is just updating some of the metrics in that regard and showing that our human pressures on biodiversity in Ontario and from Ontario's consumption on a planetary basis is very high, and it is not projected to be declining into the future. And so that sort of raises the challenge of reducing Ontario's ecological footprint. So that's an example. Then at a provincial scale, at a municipal scale, we've partnered with, for example, the Rural Ontario Institute that has used our research to generate what they call environmental dashboards to allow cities to better understand the biocapacity assets that are within the municipal boundary, that they have often some degree of influence or control over from, let's say, a zoning perspective. And we have also partnered with other organizations to develop what we call footprint calculators. So, for example, we partnered with the Métis Nation of Ontario to develop a Métis-focused ecological footprint calculator for them to use in engaging with Métis people in Ontario to understand ecological footprint and how that relates to the capacity of lands and waters to sustain us. But I guess in putting this all together, then it's up to anyone who uses our data and our information to understand it and to use it to comment on issues from a public policy perspective. As you mentioned before, there are big questions now around not only things like nature strategies, but there's also big questions being asked, appropriately so, around the Canadian federal government's plans to ramp up spending on mega projects involving infrastructure, involving a lot of significant transformations of lands and waters in the landscape. And so this information, I would say, ought to be used by people who are interested or concerned about questions of mega project construction and so on, to help anchor a lot of these big ideas into the realities of what that means from a landscape perspective in terms of affecting our lands and waters and their capacity to sustain us.
So, now that this data is public, what do you want people and policymakers to start thinking hard about when it comes to reducing Canada's ecological footprint?
Well, I'd like people in policy to appreciate that Canada engages in a lot of trade with the rest of the world, and the imports and exports that Canada has with the rest of the world are very significant from an ecological footprint and biocapacity perspective. Canada, for each dollar of exports from Canada, uses or requires about twice as much of the surface area in Canada as each dollar of imports into Canada from the rest of the world. Our trade is very demanding on the lands and waters in Canada. It tends to be very, very material intensive. It tends to be very intensive with respect to, for example, forest products, also crop products, and so on. And so when we're talking about things like trade agendas between Canada and the rest of the world, we really should be anchoring that in understanding and appreciating what that means from a landscape perspective in Canada. So that's one of the things I would say Secondly, when Canadian policymakers are engaging in a lot of economic strategies and environmental strategies, I think it's really important to reflect on the ultimate aims and objectives of what we want for all of us. And this is maybe a bit of a simplification, but I would say generally speaking, we all want the good life. We all want some degree of contentment with our life, strengthen relationships with others, etc. Many researchers can call that life satisfaction or happiness, and there's a lot of statistics and research in tracking the evolution of the average and the variability of happiness and life satisfaction in Canada. You can combine those statistics and that data with data that we provide in terms of ecological footprint. And when we put it together, it does sound some alarm bells, I would say, because Canada's average life satisfaction has been declining in recent years. And that, of course, is unfortunate because that's something we want more of. At the same time, our ecological footprint is very high. So when we put those two things together, we can make comparisons between Canada and other countries in the world. We can also compare where Canada was historically to where we are now. And I would really hope that that policymakers and people who are interested in public policy would keep sort of life satisfaction, well-being in mind at the same time of ecological footprint. From a simple perspective, when we integrate those two things, you can almost say that the sort of ratio that ought to be important is the ratio of life satisfaction in the numerator and then ecological footprint in the denominator. The more that we can improve upon life satisfaction without increasing our ecological footprint, the better. The more that we can reduce our ecological footprint without undermining our life satisfaction, the better. Put them together, I think that's sort of a recipe, I would say, that we should be focused on.
Eric Miller, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and really appreciate sharing your expertise on this subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Eric Miller is the director of York University's Ecological Footprint Initiative. A chorus of drums ushered in the world premiere of the film We Are Made from the Land at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. The film tells the story of the creation of the River Watershed Alliance. Back in 2019, 4 First Nations formed the alliance to protect the area for future generations. This included the Sayese Dene, Northlands Denisulide, and the Barren Lands and Opipinapiwan Cree Nations. Opipinapiwan chief, Shirley Ducharme, says the film's release is historic.
For the world to know that as Indigenous people, the land and the waters are sacred. And that's how we brought this forth, thinking about our ancestors and how we wanted to preserve our cultures through these lands and the waters.
That was a clip from a story that I covered back in 2024 on the Cierra River Watershed Alliance. At 50,000 square kilometers, the Cierra River in northern Manitoba is one of the largest intact watersheds left on Earth. So, to draw some comparisons, that's just under the size of Nova Scotia, which is about 52,000 square kilometers, and over 7 times the size of the Greater Toronto Area. The watershed is also home to over 30 at-risk species and nearly 200,000 caribou. So, around the time the story you just heard aired, the Alliance was urging the government to designate the watershed as an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, or an IPCA. In March 2025, the Manitoba government released a report affirming the feasibility of establishing a protected area in the Cierra River watershed. Fast forward to April 2026, the Alliance, alongside Manitoba and Canada, submitted a proposal to designate the entire watershed as an IPCA. As the Cierra River Watershed Alliance's executive director, Stephanie Thorassie has been at the forefront of this movement for years. And she joins me now with more about the proposal and the role that IPCAs might play in ecological restoration. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us.
Masicho, thank you for having me.
So I'm wanting to start, can you tell us a bit about this proposal that the Alliance submitted with Manitoba and Canada?
Absolutely, I'd love to. The communities of the Alliance have been working together really hard for the past 7 years to bring this project to life. The proposal does a really great job of bringing that work that we've done out in the communities with engagement, with public, with stakeholders. And what it does is it talks about our plans and hopes to protect the entirety of the watershed from industrial development. We hope to do this in partnership with the federal government as well as the provincial government. And we are hoping to do so with this mosaic approach of protections. So first and foremost, it would be an IPCA. It would be an Indigenous protected and conserved area. Guided by our nations, our cultures, our languages, first and foremost, utilizing our Indigenous laws to steward the lands as we have done for millennia. And then we would look to Crown governments like provincial parks and national parks to lay that on top of some different areas to really secure protection forever. So 2/3 is proposed to be a provincial park and 1/3 is proposed to be a national park. So the proposal isn't completed, it isn't finalized. We're really, we put the proposal on Engage MB, a Manitoba requirement for consultation to seek the public's opinions of this proposal. We're looking for Manitobans, Canadians, we're looking for everybody to help us, to ask us questions, to tell us whether they support the work we're doing. We're really looking forward to collecting all that feedback and then utilizing that information to help us move forward with the next steps.
And so for people who aren't familiar with the Steel River, how would you describe it?
The Steel River watershed is 50,000 square kilometers of pristine lands and waters that you can drink from the side of a canoe. We have an immense amount of land that is free of roads. There's only one community in the entire map of the watershed, and that's my home community of Taduli Lake. We have 200,000 caribou that migrate through the community. We have beluga whales that have their babies at the mouth of the Steel River, which is in the Hudson's Bay. We have barrenland grizzlies. We have over 30 species at risk that call the watershed their home. So this area on the planet is actually untouched nature as it's been since the planet has been around. And so we have a really amazing opportunity to preserve this area of Manitoba as a gift for the rest of the world and as a gift for Manitobans to preserving nature, because it's really hard to come by these types of spaces now in the world.
And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what an Indigenous protected and conserved area is with that designation and what sorts of protections it affords.
Yeah, I had an IPCA, or Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, is a really beautiful, unique thing that what works for us in our nations, in our area and territory, is not necessarily what the IPCA would look like in another area. What is so beautiful about these types of protection measures is that it really utilizes the community members, the nation's laws, the habitat, the animals, and takes all of that into consideration when creating a protected space. So it doesn't paint an area all the same. What works for us will not work for the prairies and will not work for BC coastal communities, so that's what's so amazing about IPCAs is they are really different depending on the nations that are driving the forces behind it that are wanting to create them. So for us, we utilize our Dene, which I am, and our Cree communities that are a part of the Alliance to help make sure that this project reflects the people on the ground and our communities that live there and have lived there for thousands and thousands of years. We're harnessing that knowledge and that information from our communities to help be the guiding principles for this project. And so we are so proud of this work because it's taken us, we've been doing this for over 7 years now. And it's 10 years now since we started really thinking and dreaming about how do we help our nations have a voice and a seat at the table to help continue to protect the land and waters and help be a voice for the caribou. And this is one of those vehicles for getting that done.
Earlier on this episode, we spoke with Eric Miller, who's the director of York University's Ecological Footprint Initiative. And we spoke to him about Canada's ecological footprint. And I'm wondering, sort of connecting these two ideas, how do you think IPCAs support Canada's goals of protecting lands and waters?
Well, it's beautiful. It's a really great idea to trying to preserve our planet and have oxygen to breathe. The watershed, it holds over like tons and tons of carbon in the watershed, which slowly turns into oxygen. So just by preserving it and protecting it, we're actually helping the planet breathe better. This idea that 30 by 30, which was something that was passed at the United Nations at COP 15 or 14, I believe. It is one of the ways where the world is making commitments to protecting nature so that we're continue to have somewhere to live in this world, right? And so Canada joined on to that commitment, and we think, that working with the Indigenous communities that are wanting to create protected spaces is a really nice way of honoring the knowledge that our community members have and really placing that big word of reconciliation and putting it into action and really honoring the community members and the voices that have been on the land forever. It's really about how do we ensure that we're doing this in the best way possible. And the most successful protected areas in the world are all stewarded by Indigenous people. This is proven facts. And so working with community members across Canada is the only way that this will be successful. And this is the reality of the world that we live in right now. And so for Canada to step up and say that they recognize and they honor that this is the only way to be successful, I think it's really a beautiful place for us.
What is the role of Indigenous land guardianship, stewardship, and governance in this process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Our community members are the ones on the ground in the communities. They're the eyes and ears on the land. They're the ones letting us know what's happening. There's literally caribou in the front of my community on the ice right now, traveling. They're going to be going up back to the Barrenlands, to the tundra. It's the land guardians who are the ones monitoring, doing the science work, utilizing Indigenous knowledge to be the best guardians that they can be out there on the land. They are the ones that are communicating with our elders on the ground and our leadership to help make sure that we're going in the right direction with this project. And they're the ones that make sure that our community meetings are ready to go and are set up and that community members are aware. And so they are this really pivotal part of this project. And not only are they doing the land work, they're also doing the community work and the engagement that has to happen with community members, because this is driven by the community. And if we didn't have the community voices here, the 40-something advisors that I have that help guide this work, we wouldn't be in the place we are and as far as we are in the process today. So it's really, they are the most important part of this project, the community members on the ground.
We know that the public engagement period for the proposal is set to close on June 2nd, and I'm wondering, how can Manitobans share their input?
That's a really wonderful question. Thank you for asking. We are really excited for Manitobans to go on engagemb.ca, and on there you can see the little box that says Cierra River Watershed take survey. So you click on that and then you register to make an account. And once you register, you can take the survey, and there's approximately a space for 5,000 words. So you can leave your comments, questions, concerns, or words of support. If you are happy to see this area of land being proposed for protection, we want to hear all of that. And it really helps us in the work that we're doing moving forward. It's super important for a Made in Manitoba project to have the comments and to have the feedback from Manitobans, because we really do value the information that is coming back on there. We have just under 2 weeks left of time for people to leave their comments. So we're hoping that the momentum that we've had so far to date will continue, because we're doing fairly well in terms of the amount of comments coming in. We're really proud of that.
Ahead of that deadline, what do you want people to know about the importance of protecting the Cierra River watershed for future generations?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's really, really special and important to have this protected space for us to go and visit, not only as community members, but as Manitobans. We want to ensure tourism is continued in the watershed. We want to make sure that people can still continue to come up to the watershed. There is all of the lodges that are in the watershed that we're really happy to have continued support from us. We want those businesses that are in the area to prosper. We want to create more jobs. We want people to come and visit, and we want them to paddle the Cierra River. These are all like ways that we hope to be sustainable into the future, to have these jobs for our community members and the youth. We want to make sure that there is safe space for caribou and all of the other species at risk to call this place home. Millions and millions of birds come in the springtime and summer with us, and go down as far as South America and Antarctica. They have crazy migration routes. And so for the biodiversity and the nature reasons, the lists are so huge and so large. But culturally, we think it's so important to have a safe space to practice our cultures, to speak our languages, and to welcome visitors to participate in our cultures with us is a really something that we have hope for the future. And history has given us a lot of difficult memories of our partnerships, or the way that Canada has treated us to date. And we look at this protected area as a new way of working together and a new way of writing our own story, because this is something we haven't had the opportunity to do up till this point in our existence, especially as a member of Tuduli Lake. So we look forward to the future in ways that we can celebrate our languages, our cultures, the environment, the caribou, and share that in a good way with the world.
Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Really appreciate it. And yeah, super excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Stephanie Thorassie is the Executive Director of the Cierra River Watershed Alliance. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. And if you have any comments or ideas, email us at infocus@aptn.ca. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
What is Indian status in Canada, and what can it be used for? We see a lot of comments online about how First Nations people can use their status to get things like tax exemptions, free housing, free education, and more. But what's the truth about status and the reality of these so-called free aspects? I'm Savannah Kelly. Join me and my co-host Jesse Andrushko on APTN News Answers, a new series where we shed light on topics related to current events and issues facing Indigenous people. Watch now on the APTN News YouTube channel.